Dauntless 1.6.3 is upon us, and there's a lot of things that are in this update. I made a separate video covering a lot of those things, and you guys should totally check it out if you're interested in seeing these things. This video right here is going to be specifically about the new pulse cell. We are going to analyze why this is perhaps the most weird and polarized cell to ever be created in Dauntless so far. Hello everyone, I am Trevor, I go by TheMrTrails, welcome to the channel. Before we get into it, I just want to say if you enjoyed Dauntless and are not subscribed already, consider subscribing to the channel. I post Dauntless content here every week. And if you're here rather early, there's a good chance that I'm doing a hangout session over on my Twitch right now, twitch.tv/TheMrTrails, where we're messing around with a lot of things in the new update. This update brought to us the new Radiant Legendary Behemoth, as well as a new Hunt Pass and some store items. And if you're thinking about making any purchases this season, consider using code TheMrTrails. Make sure the A is before the I. So the pulse cell is an interesting one, and as I described previously, it's possibly the most polarizing cell we've ever seen. It's absolutely crazy at just a +3 in certain circumstances, however in others it performs just the same as a Wild Frenzy or Berserker would. Taking a look at what the effectiveness levels are, at a minimum it guarantees a crit on every 10th weapon hit. This goes up to every 8th hit when you're at +3 and every 5th hit when you're at +6. It doesn't have any sort of timer on these hits, so you're able to traverse from fight to fight and still have the previous hits or even the guaranteed crit stored up. And starting at +4, you'll gain extra critical strike damage through the crit multiplier, and at +6 it grants you +15% crit damage. Now your first thought when you hear this cell has to deal with crits is that you should forever and always pair this cell with Cunning 6. However, that's not necessarily the case, and you do have to be careful about when you do it. You have to balance out damage increases with crits, and if you don't have enough damage, the value of the crits is likely to be lower than the value of the other cells that you would be able to provide for the build. I'm going to reference Texas Rangers Malkarian Trial Chainblade's mounting build for this one. With the amount of stamina management that you have to do in the Malkarian Trial when mounting, there's pretty much no room for damaging perks on the build. You've not only got to use Catalyst 6 with Stamina Tonic, but Conditioning and Endurance 6 as well, as the main plan is the longer you can stay on Malkarian, the more damage you inevitably do to it. And then with the length of the fight and how high the base damage of the Chainblade's mounted attacks are, Tenacious is a pretty solid choice with the Skarn Chainblades, as you'll get to 100% crit chance once you've removed about 30 to 40% of its HP. And a major strategy for Malkarian Trial is to take damage at the beginning to gain Blitz Tonic stacks to attack faster, meaning that you don't really have any damage from Tenacious. Meaning that with 27 of our 36 perk economy on this build, the only damage increase we have is from the Frenzy Tonic. In order to get one of our power slots for Tenacious, we have to use a piece with Rage, which will give us an extra 12% damage, and then the decision becomes whether to use Predator or Cunning. And when you do the math, because of how low your damage increases are at this point, even when you have guaranteed crits, Predator is still beating the damage output from running Cunning. And that is also going to be the case with a lot of builds and Pulse. It doesn't really matter if you're critting if you've had to sacrifice a whole lot of damage to get those crits. And if you were thinking to pair this cell with your Skarn Tenacious build, I'm sorry, but that won't be very good either. The point of running Skarn Tenacious is to guarantee that everything crits, so you're not going to care about if you only have certain hits critting. Now I said that the cell is rather busted in some cases, but is not so busted in other cases. In order to understand why this is, let's take a look at what the cell strengths do on average. As I mentioned, +1 pulse makes every 10th hit crit, meaning a guarantee of 10% of your hits are going to crit, and that's arguably already better than Cunning, which is just a 10% chance for it to happen, and that's just a +1 pulse. However, you would argue that Cunning outshines it here because with that 10% crit chance, you also have 30% crit damage. At +3, it becomes every 8th hit, meaning a guarantee of 12.5% of your hits are going to crit. However, again, because of the extra crit severity, Cunning is technically going to translate to more damage even though you're critting less often. But what about at +6, where you have every 5th hit crit as as well as plus 15% crit damage. Well, this is 20% of your hits critting at 15% extra crit damage when they do, whereas Cunning is 10% of your hits critting on average and 30% extra crit damage when they do. And what this sort of translates to is, without any sort of special circumstances, Pulse and Cunning provide roughly the same average damage bonus, where Cunning has a higher ceiling of what it can do, whereas Pulse would be the more consistent option of the two. So wait, if it's pretty similar damage output to Cunning when it's at Pulse plus 6, then why would I say it could be absolutely broken in some cases even when it's just at plus 3? Well, to answer that, we need to talk about parallel universes. Wait, that's the wrong game. But we do need to add a new term to your Dauntless vocabulary, and that is hit syncing. The idea here is that you want to get Pulse to sync up or activate at the same time as your larger hits to guarantee that those are the hits getting the benefit of the crits. On Chainblades, for example, you'd much rather have that 10 stack Reaper's Dance Slam, which has 2000 base damage, get a crit, as opposed to one of your 100 base damage hits critting. And if you were to sync the Pulse with your first attack against an escalation boss, this would take out a lot of the RNG requirement for Axe escalation one-shot builds. But so far, it seems that by far the most valuable form of hit syncing has to deal with the Hellion unique effect. The Hellion unique effect is very similar to Pulse. It's just that instead of a guaranteed crit, that attack will have plus 225 added to its base damage. What's more is that aside from Chainblades, every Hellion weapon has a value of Pulse that it syncs up with. For repeaters, the Hellion unique effect is every 10th hit, which matches up with Pulse plus 1. However, I would probably just recommend going for Pulse plus 6 in that case, because you'll get it synced up anyway, but you'll also get an additional guaranteed crit. For Strikers, Sword, and Warpike, it aligns nicely with Pulse plus 3, being every 8th hit of the Hellion weapon. And for Axe and Hammer, every 5th hit from the Hellion weapons will proc the unique effect, which syncs up with Pulse plus 6. So from a fresh start on your island, you are already going to have the Hellion unique effect synced up with your Pulse to guarantee that the bonus damage of the Hellion unique effect also leads to a critical hit. However, there is a problem that Pulse has that is holding it back from being even better, and it's that certain things can cause the desync of the Pulse hit from your bigger hits. The main stem of this problem is how the use of the Pulse itself gets consumed. Any damage that is dealt after building up this charge from Pulse will activate it. And I do mean any damage, even if the damage isn't capable of critting, like item type damage. Meaning that if your Radiant Drone or your Lantern does damage when you have that use of Pulse before you can hit the behemoth with your weapon, it's basically going to be as if you didn't have Pulse at all. And this makes Pulse, and arguably the best lantern in the game, the Pangar Lantern, just about unplayable together. And it makes you have to tread very carefully when using Drask or Embermane lanterns, and makes you want to activate them only at certain times. Now that we've discussed the cell and what makes it good or bad, let's talk about some of the builds that it will work particularly well with, and explain why some builds or weapons don't work so well with it. We'll start by explaining which weapons don't exactly get a lot of benefit from the cell. Chainblades, as I mentioned, don't really have the ability to sync up the Hellion unique effect with Pulse. The Hellion unique effect on Chainblades procs every 11 hits, and this doesn't sync up nicely with any of the values of Pulse whatsoever. However, when it comes to Hellion Chainblades, you likely don't even need Pulse, because you already have Serrated Blades when you're playing Hellion Chainblades in the first place. Serrated Blades will make it so 7 of your 12 hits of your light heavy light combo will crit, meaning that it's honestly enough damage output for Hellion Chainblades as it is, as it's very likely that your Hellion unique effect will sync up with a proc of Serrated Blades. For other Chainblades, what you could try to do is sync up Reaper's Dance with your uses of Pulse. For Pulse plus 6, you can do a light heavy light combo and follow it up with either 3 Reaper's Dances or 1 light attack and a Reaper's Dance. And for Pulse plus 3, you can just use the light heavy light combo, and the Pulse will actually sync up with the combo finisher every 2 combos. combos. However, when I played around with this, I still wasn't getting amazing results with it even when the attacks were being synced properly, likely due to serrated blades. For repeaters, their uses for pulse are limited due to them currently only having a maximum of 30 offensive perk economy available to them. The other perks in the build basically need to be Predator 6, Berserker 6, Rage 6 at a minimum to be able to make the value of the crits matter, and that's a pretty hard build to muster up due to repeaters not having prismatic slots for the time being. And strikers have a bit of an unfortunate case for them. As I mentioned, any damage dealt currently consumes the use of pulse, and this would include the damage dealt by the duration over time effect of Karma Breaker, and you kind of need Karma Breaker on strikers to be able to deal as much damage as you can with Titan's Crash or Adamant Bolt. Funnily enough, if you chose to sync up pulse with the Hellion strikers and just forget about Karma Breaker, you'll actually end up dealing about the same amount of damage as if you were using the Hellion strikers normally without pulse. And that goes to show how huge the damage output bonus can be when you sync the Hellion unique effect and pulse properly. It's just unfortunate that strikers aren't really able to get a practical benefit from the cell whatsoever, at least in its current state. And that leaves us with Sword, Hammer, Warpike, and Axe. We'll start with Hammer and Axe, both of these having 5 hits on their Hellion unique effects to activate, which lines up with Pulse plus 6. I would say that the Hammer gets more benefit of the two, and this comes from the horizontal hammers combo, or helicoptering as the community likes to say. With how this cell works, hitting all of the 10 hits of your helicopter combo syncs up the hits of Pulse with the Hellion unique effect pretty well, and the hit of the Aether Slam is one of the hits that gets the benefit of that crit. Against the training dummy, there was some pretty solid results, with a build of 6 Cunning, 6 Pulse, 6 Predator, 3 Berserker, 3 Conduit, 3 Discipline, 3 Overpower, 3 Rage, and 3 Wild Frenzy. Though since the training dummies don't have a good way of showing how Overpower increases your damage output drastically, you'll likely want to replace the Berserker or Wild Frenzy for a second Overpower in a real situation, or just forego Cunning at that point. But the build uses Torgadoro Hammer with Berserker and Wild Frenzy, the Shroud Helmet with Discipline, the Thrax Chest with Cunning, the Malkarian Gloves with Predator, the Chronivore Legs with Pulse, and the Drask Lantern with Conduit. You can get a solid 3.5 to 4.5 thousand damage per second with this setup against the dummies with the helicopter combo as long as your hits are syncing properly. Keep in mind that damage against training dummies doesn't translate to damage against the behemoths all of the time unless you really know what you're doing. For the Axe, I would more say just to forget about Pulse with it, as the average results are pretty similar to that of strikers even with the level 4 determination. However, this build with the Axe does have a very high DPS ceiling, though it can't keep up for longer than one combo. The build I was using here is the same as the Hammer build, but with 6 Wild Frenzy in the weapon instead of 3 Berserker. With level 4 determination and a Lantern hold already charged up, you can get over 7,000 damage per second out of your first combo plus the Axe throw. As the nature of the Axe is, though, it will swiftly tank after this to about 4,000 damage per second after 2 combos, or 3,000 damage per second after 3 combos, which again brings it about in line with strikers even when the cell isn't properly working for strikers. But I just wanted to show this to see how nutty it could be in certain burst damage scenarios, and Axe in general does benefit from this cell, particularly when it comes to those escalation one-shot builds. This leaves us with the Sword and the Warpike, which are the Hellion weapons I would say benefit the most from this new cell addition. I already showed off what the capabilities of the Ardent Cyclone Sword builds would be in this experimental test that we had Pulse in. However, there was an issue in that test that made Pulse even better than it actually is. But you are still capable of the nearly 4,500 sustained damage per second and even more that was shown off in that test. It just comes down to a slightly different build. A big thank you to Captain Maelstrom for this build. Be sure to check him out if you haven't already. This build uses 6 Berserker, 6 Cunning, 6 Predator, 3 Conduit, 3 Discipline, 3 Overpower, 3 Pulse, 3 Rage, and 3 Wild Frenzy. It uses the Torgadoro Sword with Berserker and Wild Frenzy inside, the Shroud Helmet with Discipline inside, the Thrax Chest with Cunning inside, the Malkarian Gloves with Predator inside, the Chronivore Legs with Berserker inside, and the Embermane Lantern with Conduit inside. As I mentioned, Lantern damage or the Radiant Drone consumes the Pulse stack if it deals damage at the same time as the stack is active and causes a desync, so it can be kind of RNG based to get the maxed out results here. here. But over the course of even 150,000 damage, which is about Dauntless trial level HP, you're able to get an upwards of 4,800 damage per second, and Captain Maelstrom said he was able to get the number over 5,000 in some cases. And I do have one more build for you guys today, and that is for the Pike. Now this build isn't going to be focused on maxing out the DPS against the training dummy, but rather focus on the sheer power that Pulse would be capable of on the Pike, due to it having the ability to run savagery. We've got 6 Catalyst, 6 Cunning, 6 Predator, 6 Savagery, 3 Discipline, 3 Overpower, 3 Pulse, and 3 Rage. This uses the Torgadora Pike bonded to Hellion with Catalyst and Savagery inside. For the armor, it's the Shroud Helmet with Discipline inside, the Thrax Chest with Cunning inside, the Malkarian Gloves with Predator inside, the Chronivore Legs with Savagery inside, and the Drask Lantern with Catalyst inside. I used this build in a Frost Escalation to check it out, and the results were stunning. Just look at how fast I melted this Scrave on round 3. I hope you enjoyed the melting, and that will about do it for this video. Pulse was a very interesting cell to take a look at, and again, it's a pretty weird cell in how it can be super overpowered in some cases, but not super impressive in other ones. We'll have to keep an eye on whether or not the not so impressive cases, particularly the ones where the cell becomes useless, are fixed, or if in the really good cases we see a potential nerf. But with this along with the other changes coming in 1.6.3, you better believe I'm very excited about the current events in Dauntless. I would like to thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed, consider leaving a like on the video. If you haven't yet, check out the other video I released today about the major changes that are coming in 1.6.3, including a peek of the new Hunt Pass as well as our new legendary Radiant Behemoth, the Chronivore. And if you've already checked that out as well, be sure to head over to the Twitch, twitch.tv/TheMrTrails, where we will be grinding out a lot of the new content in this update over the next few days and potentially even doing some Hunt Pass giveaways. And if you enjoy Dauntless and are not subscribed already, consider subscribing to the channel. I post Dauntless content here every week. I have been Trevor, I go by TheMrTrails, and I will catch you guys next time.